fog clung low to the cobbles of Wessex Lane, wrapping the narrow London alley in a ghostly silence. A constable stood guard outside number 12, a three-story Georgian townhouse whose windows flickered dimly with gaslight. Inside, Inspector Lestrade paced the drawing-room, his boots echoing softly on the polished floorboards. A fire burned low in the hearth, the warmth doing little to counter the chill of mystery that had gripped the house. Since morning, the victim, Jonathan Rowe, had been found slumped over his writing desk, a poet of middling fame, known for his haunting verses and recluse nature. The room was undisturbed, the front door locked from within, and the single window bolted. No signs of forced entry, no weapon, no apparent cause of death. Yet Rowe's face was frozen in an expression of terror, eyes wide, lips parted as if caught mid-scream. A delicate porcelain cup, tipped and cracked, lay near his hand, its tea pooled across the desk and dripping faintly onto the floor. Lestrade looked up sharply when footsteps approached down the hallway. Sherlock Holmes entered, like a silhouette out of the fog, his tall frame casting long shadows against the flickering wall sconces. Dr. Watson followed close behind, removing his gloves as he took in the somber mood of the room. "Well, Lestrade," Holmes said, voice clipped, "I trust you didn't summon me for a man who merely died of fright." Lestrade huffed. "If you can explain how a man locks himself inside a room, dies with no visible wound, and leaves behind a riddle instead of a will, then I'll happily concede the floor. A riddle." Holmes stepped over to the writing desk. Beside the poet's hand, untouched by the tea's spreading stain, was a single sheet of paper with one stanza, written in Rowe's recognizable scrawl, "Beneath the lily where secrets sleep. A wordless vow I was sworn to keep. The ink runs dry where silence grew. He who reads must follow through." Holmes read it twice, eyes narrowing, curious. There's poetic ambiguity, yes, but there's something precise about the structure. He meant for this to be found. Watson leaned over Holmes' shoulder. "Could it be a suicide note in verse?" "Possibly," Holmes murmured. "But then where is the means? No poison in the tea, Watson. You'd smell it. No bruising, no signs of struggle, and no exit. He didn't stab himself with metaphor." Lestrade interjected. "We checked for cyanide and laudanum, nothing. His body's going to the coroner. But frankly, the undertaker's no more baffled than we are." Holmes turned and surveyed the room. Shelves of books lined the walls, mostly poetry. Some philosophy. A small cabinet contained half-used candles, ink bottles, and sealing wax. No signs of a struggle. No disturbed dust on the floorboards. The poet had died quietly, in the middle of composing a riddle. Holmes knelt and examined the floor beneath the desk. His gloved fingers tapped the edge of a scuffed floorboard. He tilted his head. "Watson, your penknife, if you please." Watson passed it over, and Holmes worked the edge of the board with quiet precision. With a soft click, the plank lifted. Inside the shallow space lay a leather-bound notebook. Holmes retrieved it, unfastened the clasp, and flipped through the pages. Verse after verse in Rowe's hand until the final entries took a darker turn. There are mentions of a man named Felix Dorn, Holmes noted aloud, repeatedly. He waits beneath the lily, the black ink of betrayal, Dawn's voice in the wall. Highly metaphorical, but persistent. Lestrade. Does the name ring a bell? Lestrade frowned. Felix Dawn, poet laureate in his time. A bit of a scandal, if I recall, accused of plagiarism, vanished years ago. Some say he fled to France, others say Rowe blackballed him out. Of the literary circles, Holmes snapped the notebook shut. Then this is no suicide. Rowe knew something, or feared something. Watson asked, but how does that explain his death? Holmes turned toward the tea-stained desk. It doesn't. Not yet. But look closer. No trembling in his handwriting. No signs of a distressed mind. This verse was composed with clarity, and the cup, barely sipped, poisoned, Lestrade asked again. To neat, Holmes replied, if the tea were laced, we'd expect violent symptoms. No convulsions, no vomiting, no overturned chair, no desperate attempt to reach help. No, he died swiftly, quietly, as if he paused, stepping toward the window. The latch was untouched. He examined the sill. Watson, he said, didn't you notice the smell when we entered? Not of tea or ink, but something faintly floral. Watson blinked. Yes, jasmine, I thought. Holmes nodded. And you'd be right. But jasmine oil does not cause sudden death. However, there are flowers that do. The poet's verse said beneath the lily. Was it literal or symbolic? Lestrade gestured toward the fireplace mantel. There sat a white vase with wilting lilies, their petals tinged with brown. Holmes crossed the room, lifted the vase, and sniffed. His eyes sharpened. Not lilies, death comers, a wildflower similar appearance. But its scent is faintly acrid beneath the sweetness, lethally toxic. Extracted into a vapor, Watson guessed, or perhaps infused into a candle wax, slowly. Released as it burned, Holmes said, indicating the half-melted taper in the desk's holder. Lestrade looked dumbfounded. You mean he was poisoned by air? Precisely, subtle, slow, but fatal in a confined space. Holmes looked back at the body, and the door locked from within was no defense. It was the prison. The verse wasn't just poetic flourish, it was a warning. He knew someone meant to kill him, and he left us the only clue he could. Watson stared at the poem again, understanding dawning. Then he who reads must follow through. Wasn't meant for the killer. It was meant for U.S. Holmes' eyes glinted with something close to admiration. Indeed, Watson. And now it falls to us to follow where it leads. Because whoever Felix Dawn is today, he's no longer just a ghost from Rowe's past. He's a killer who crafts murder. Like a verse, quiet, elegant, and deadly. Outside, the fog thickened, curling against the windows. But inside, the case had begun to stir with life, and Sherlock Holmes was already assembling the next line. The fire had burned lower still, casting long shadows that danced like silent spectators around the dim drawing room. Inspector Lestrade was dispatching to constables to confirm Felix Dawn's last known whereabouts. Though Holmes knew it would yield little, Dawn had vanished into legend a decade ago, and legends did not appear in city registries. Holmes remained by the mantelpiece. gazing intently at the vase of lilies or rather, death comers. A flower that looks like innocence, he said quietly, and kills with grace. Watson said nothing. He was still troubled by the verse. There was something more to it, something unfinished, lingering. A soft knock on the front door echoed. Through the corridor, a moment later, the housemaid, pale and stiff, ushered in a woman. She was tall, elegant, perhaps in her early 40s, with an angular face framed by a dark hat and veil. Her gloves were immaculate, her bearing cold. Yet, beneath the composure, Holmes sensed a tight coil of tension in the way she clutched her handbag. "I'm Marjorie Rowe," she said, "Jonathan's sister." Holmes inclined his head. "You came swiftly. I was sent word by the constables. I live only 3 streets away. I heard he was." She stopped. Her eyes flicked toward the desk, then away. "Is it true? He left a poem." Lestrade stepped forward. "Did your brother often compose verse in moments of distress?" Jonathan was always writing. Poetry was how he processed the world, even grief. But this, she paused again, adjusting a ring on her gloved finger. "This isn't like him. He was afraid of something these last few months. He stopped attending the publishers' luncheons. He said he was being watched." "By whom?" Holmes asked. He wouldn't say. He called it the return of a silence long buried. "I thought he was being dramatic." Holmes studied her carefully. "Did he ever mention the name Felix Dorn for the first time?" Her composure cracked, a brief tightening of the mouth, the faintest flicker in her eyes. "No," she said, but too late. Holmes noticed and pressed. "Likely. Your brother's final writings named Dorn repeatedly." Marjorie Rowe lowered her gaze. "I knew Felix, briefly, years ago. He and Jonathan were friends, once, then rivals. I don't know what happened between them." Holmes's tone remained even. "And yet you didn't mention him just now." Curious, she looked up sharply. "I didn't think it mattered." Watson watched the exchange silently. The room had chilled again, and it wasn't from the fire. Holmes turned back to the desk. "Tell me, Miss Rowe, was your brother left-handed?" "No." "Right." Holmes nodded. "Then what do you make of this?" He gestured to the tipped teacup. The stain trailed leftward toward the inkwell, away from the writing hand. An unusual spillage pattern, unless the cup had been placed by someone standing across the desk from Jonathan, someone who would have handed him the poisoned tea. Holmes knelt, brushing his fingers across the desk's edge. A faint oily residue clung to the grain jasmine-scented wax. "Someone lit the candle and watched him die," he said. "It wasn't suicide. It was performance." Watson stepped to his side. "Then who was here?" "A friend. A former friend. Someone trusted enough to share tea with. Perhaps even enough to bring flowers." Holmes turned again to Marjorie. "Your brother kept to himself. Who visited him recently?" "No one," she said, "except, well, one man. I don't know. His name came last week. Said he was a literary agent. I only saw him briefly when I stopped by. Tall, carried a cane, dressed too finely for the neighborhood. Jonathan said it was nothing." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Could you describe him? Red hair, freckles?" polished voice, possibly Irish. Holmes exchanged a look with Watson. That may not be. A literary agent. That may be Dawn under a new name. Before Marjorie could reply, a constable returned to whisper something to Lestrade. The inspector turned grim. Something odd, Lestrade said. The coroner's begun his early assessment. He says there are signs of contact poison near the mouth lips, gums, tongue, something alkaloid. Doesn't match anything in our usual list. But it's real. Holmes nodded. Death-Kammer's sap, extracted and smeared on the rim of the cup. I suspect, inhaled through candle vapor to weaken him, ingested to finish the job. Very deliberate, Watson muttered. Too precise for revenge alone. Holmes agreed. This isn't fury. It's artistry. Murder with a flourish. He turned once more to the sheet of verse. A closer inspection revealed something subtle, an indentation near the bottom edge, as if another sheet had been removed hastily. There was a second page. Holmes said quietly, torn away, possibly stolen by the killer before he fled. Holmes examined the desk drawer. It was unlocked. Inside were letters, drafts, and a half-sealed envelope addressed to the Argus Review. A rejection slip was tucked behind it, dated 2 days prior, signed by M.D. Carrick, the editor. Holmes's brow furrowed. He turned to Lestrade. Find out if anyone at the Argus Review has had dealings with Felix Dawn in recent months, especially under other names. Also look into M.D. Carrick. Lestrade made a note. You suspect something there, perhaps. The poet feared being watched. He referenced betrayal. Someone in the publishing world might have known Dawn's whereabouts and might have served as intermediary. Holmes turned to Watson. Meanwhile, we must trace this red-haired gentleman. If Dawn has returned, he hasn't returned alone. Marjorie Rose stood stiffly. Mr. Holmes, do you believe this man will strike again? I believe, Holmes said, retrieving the notebook and tucking it into his coat, that this man is not finished composing. And if this was his opening stanza, the second verse will be worse. Outside, the fog had thinned, revealing gas lamps flickering against the night. Holmes stepped into the gloom, the weight of the notebook pressing lightly against his chest. The first line of the mystery had been penned in death now. He would follow the meter of murder to its conclusion. By mid-morning, the fog had lifted just enough to let Baker Street breathe. Holmes stood by the window of our flat, smoking thoughtfully, his eyes unfocused, but his mind thrumming like a taut wire. He held Rose's notebook in one hand and, with the other, tapped out a rhythm on the sill that matched the verse from the crime scene. He who reads must follow through. He murmured, then turned sharply. Watson, we must call on the Argus Review before the trail cools. Someone there may have read more than just verse. 20 minutes later, we stepped into the modest but crowded editorial office of the Argus Review, nestled on the 3rd floor of a Fleet Street building that smelled of paper, ink, and deadlines. Clerks bustled, typewriters clacked, and cigarette smoke hung in lazy spirals. We were greeted by a man in his 60s, with a hawkish face and thinning white hair. M.D. Carrick, as identified by the brass nameplate on his door. He rose with wary politeness. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, a surprise. Death rarely phones ahead, Holmes replied, offering the man a dry nod. We're here about Jonathan Rowe. Carrick's lips thinned. A terrible loss. A singular voice. You rejected his last submission. Carrick blinked. Yes, it wasn't malicious, simply not the standard we expect. Poets fall in and out of rhythm, so to speak. Holmes placed the half-sealed envelope on the desk. Then perhaps you'd like to explain why you returned the piece without comment. Something the Argus rarely does with regular contributors. Carrick hesitated, then folded his hands. There were whispers that he'd become erratic. His latest work seemed more like code than verse. I didn't know what to make of it. Did you share the content with anyone? No, I hadn't. Even read it fully before sending it back. I hadn't the time. Holmes studied him for a breath longer than comfort allowed. Then you won't mind if I ask your staff a few questions. Carrick hesitated, if you must. Outside the office, we were directed to Miss Eleanor Blythe, a junior proofreader who had handled some of Rowe's older pieces. She was a nervous woman with ink-stained fingers and a tendency to adjust her glasses before speaking. Mr. Rowe hadn't submitted anything in months, she said, clutching a folder to her chest. Then last week, he sent in a single poem, but it was strange. How so? Holmes asked. It didn't rhyme, and the meter was off. It read more like a cipher, to be honest. I didn't think it was meant for print. Did you recognize any names in it? Holmes pressed. She hesitated. Only one, Dawn. Holmes's voice grew sharper. You're sure? Yes. I asked Mr. Carrick if I should forward it to the senior editor. He told me to leave it be. Said Rowe was no longer relevant. Holmes gave a thin smile. He said he never read it. Eleanor paled. Then he lied. As we left the building, Holmes was already building his theory aloud. Carrick lied to us. He read that poem, recognized something in it, and suppressed it. But he didn't destroy it, he returned it to Rowe. Then, the missing second page might be that poem, I said. Precisely. And Carrick is hiding something else. Fear, perhaps. Fear of being tied to Dawn. We hadn't reached the street before a weary young man called after us, hat in hand, eyes darting. He introduced himself as Clive Renner, one of the junior typesetters. I heard you asking about Rowe, he said in a hushed voice. And Dawn. Holmes arched a brow. And there's been a man hanging about past few weeks. Came in twice pretending to be a printer from the Whitcomb Press, but he never left a name. Red hair, long coat, northern accent, trying to sound posh. I saw him near Carrick's office the day Rowe's poem arrived. Holmes's eyes darkened. Did Carrick speak with him? Not that I saw. But afterward, Carrick seemed shaken. Locked his door for an hour, which he never does. Would you recognize this red-haired man again? Certainly. He had a cane with a silver snake-head handle. Odd thing. Back on the street. Holmes was silent until we turned the corner. Then he spoke with crisp purpose. Watson, this is tightening. Dawn is no longer a ghost. He's re-entered London under false pretenses. He's watching editors, intercepting poems, killing poets who threatened exposure. Do you believe Carrick helped him? I believe Carrick is either an accomplice or. His next verse. We returned to Wessex Lane shortly after, where Lestrade was interviewing the housemaid from number 12 again. Her name was Gwen, and she stood nervously in the foyer, wringing her apron. I remembered something odd. She said, when prompted, the day before Master Rowe died, he received a small parcel, wrapped in brown paper. No return address. Holmes's eyes lit. What was in it? I don't know. He took it straight to his study, but I remember he looked troubled afterward, kept glancing over his shoulder, like he thought someone was watching. Lestrade asked, and the packaging? I burnt it the next morning. Just old paper, I thought. Holmes turned to the fireplace, where cold ashes sat at the grate. He knelt, sifted delicately, and withdrew a scrap of waxed string, frayed at one end. No shipping seal, no label, only a string, lightly tied by hand. He sniffed it. Faint scent of cedar oil. A writer's touch. Dawn again. At that moment, Marjorie Rowe reappeared in the corridor. Her face was pale, her voice low. There's something I didn't mention. Holmes turned. Jonathan received a letter 3 days before he died. He wouldn't let me see it, but I caught part of the heading. It read, "From the ashes, a voice rises." Holmes stared at her, then said very softly, "Dawn's old pseudonym, Watson." And I exchanged glances. Marjorie's hands trembled. He said if anything happened to him, the truth would still find its way into print. Unless, Holmes said, straightening, the killer edits the final line. He stepped back, his mind now fully ablaze. Dawn is writing something, perhaps. A manifesto, perhaps a final collection of verse. But he's silencing every witness who might understand its true meaning. Watson asked the question that now hung between us. Then who's next? Holmes glanced again at the ashes, the waxed string, the vanished second page. His voice, when it came, was ice. Whoever still knows how the poem ends. A chill wind pushed against the windows of Baker Street as Holmes sat cross-legged in his armchair, rose-stained notebook open across his lap, and the rejected envelope from the Argus Review pinned under his fingers. I watched him from my chair, untouched tea cooling beside me, as he murmured the lines to himself for the 100th time. The voice that sleeps in ashes speaks. His rhyme returns. The silence breaks. Holmes closed the notebook with a snap. There are too many motives, Watson, and not enough sense. Let us lay them out. He rose, paced once, then began to speak aloud as though arranging pieces on a board. Jonathan Rowe feared Felix Dawn enough to encode his poetry, to isolate himself, to anticipate death. That gives us fear as one motive. But fear of what? Murder, I said. Fear is rarely so simple. He turned. Next, M.D. Carrick. He lies about reading the poem, is clearly unnerved by Dawn's reappearance, and yet chooses not to alert anyone. Why? To protect the magazine, I offered. Perhaps. Or perhaps Carrick once helped Dawn disappear, and Rowe's verse threatened to bring that secret to light. He moved again, quicker now. Then Marjorie, a sister who lives 3 streets away, yet claims she saw her brother only briefly. She knew Dawn denied it until pressed. There is tension between her words and her expressions. You think she's lying? I think she's hiding something, whether for guilt or shame. I cannot yet say. And the red-haired man with the canif that is Dawn, he's more than a killer. He's a composer. Each murder is part of some twisted final act. Holmes nodded sharply. So, we ask, what connects them all? Dawn, Roe, Carrick, Marjorie. A knock came at that moment, quick, firm. Lestrade entered, his face drawn but determined. We found the cane, he said, without greeting. A pawnshop on Limehouse Pier. The shopkeeper said it was sold 3 days ago by a man in a black scarf. Speaking with a northern accent, said he needed cash urgently, gave a false name Martin Vale. Holmes's eyes narrowed. That name appears in Roe's correspondence. A minor literary rival. Vanished 10 years ago. Another ghost Dawn may be hiding behind. Lestrade added, there's more. I spoke with a fellow editor at the Argus, name of Colin Swale. Swale says Carrick's been receiving anonymous letters for months, cut up lines of poetry, cryptic verses. He didn't show them to anyone, because he knew who wrote them, Holmes said softly. Dawn. The room fell into silence. A killer who wrote his threats in verse. A publisher to frighten Dawn, complicit to act. A poet who tried to warn the world through metaphor. And yet, Holmes said after a pause, none of it explains why now. Why Dawn returned after a decade. Why he chose Roe first. We needed answers that poetry alone could not give. Holmes proposed a visit to Carrick's residence quietly, without Lestrade. That evening, we arrived at the man's home in Kensington. The curtains were drawn, the gaslights dim. Carrick answered reluctantly, his hands trembling despite his polished tone. I told you everything. You told us what suited you. Holmes replied, we have it on good authority you've been receiving verse by post anonymous, taunting. Carrick's mask cracked. He let us in without another. Word. His study smelled of mildew and old ink. A box sat atop his desk, tied with string. Inside were several scraps of paper, each with lines scrawled in uneven handwriting. Holmes picked one up. The editor edits but cannot erase. The sin he sealed in silence's face. Another, you, printed his fame, then buried his name. Now the fire turns back to flame. Carrick slumped into a chair. He blames me. He's right, in part. Years ago, I helped Felix Dawn disappear. Not for money, for reputation. He'd grown unstable. He threatened to expose several names in the poetry world. Said he'd learned secrets from men who used verse as masks. Blackmail? I asked. Worse, manipulation. Felix had a way of coaxing confession through conversation, then bleeding it into his work. Roe knew that. They quarreled after a reading in '89. Then Dawn vanished. We assumed he'd left the country. Holmes looked at the papers again. And now he's returned. To destroy those who silenced him. Carrick nodded, defeated. He's playing a long game. One I helped begin. Holmes's eyes lingered on a final scrap in the box. It read, "To stood still when I fell from grace, now both shall taste my second face." Do. Holmes repeated, Roe. And you. Carrick's voice trembled. And the second? Holmes turned. That depends. Did Marjorie Rowe help you cover it up? Carrick blinked. No. She was Dawn's lover briefly. He left her when he vanished. Perhaps she never forgave him, or perhaps she never recovered. It was nearing midnight when we left Carrick's house. The air had turned bitter. Holmes spoke little as we walked. He's laying blame with surgical precision, he said at last. Each target reflects a part of his past, those who betrayed, abandoned, or exposed him. And Marjorie? I asked. Holmes's reply was soft. She is not innocent, but I do not yet know which way her guilt leans. Back at Baker Street, Holmes spread the scraps across the table. There is one more motive we have not considered, Watson. Art. Dawn is not just punishing these people, he's composing a final message. He's orchestrating a poem through murder. A poem? I asked. A sequence. Rowe was the opening verse. Carrick is the middle line, and the next death. He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he turned back to the notebook, eyes flaring with fresh purpose. We need to find the second page of Rowe's final work. It's the key to Dawn's intent, and whoever holds it is already in danger, I said. Holmes nodded, or part of the final stanza. Morning broke cold and pale across the rooftops of London, but Holmes had not slept. The second page of Rowe's final poem remained missing, and without it, he refused to close the circle Dawn had so meticulously drawn in blood and verse. I had risen early to find him bent over a table cluttered with pages Rowe's notebook, Carrick's anonymous threats, even transcripts of older Dawn poems we gathered from the archives. He didn't glance up. We are missing the turning word, Watson, he murmured. The verse that shifts the tone. Rowe wrote it, concealed it, perhaps gave it to someone. But whom? A sharp knock interrupted our thoughts. Lestrade entered with the brisk air of a man ready to deliver triumph. Morning, Holmes. You'll be pleased to know we've made an arrest. Holmes didn't move. Who? Clive Renner. The typesetter from the Argus. We searched his flat, found a page of Rowe's missing poem, tucked into a copy of the Hollow Bell. The poem matches the meter, even references ashes and voices. We also found a burned glove, red hair clinging to it. The cane at the pawn shop he admitted pawning it, said. He needed money, but wouldn't say why. Now Holmes turned, slowly. And your conclusion? He had motive, knew both Rowe and Carrick, worked alone after hours, could have stolen the envelope and tracked Rowe down. That's enough for now. We've brought him in. Holmes stared. And the poem? What does it say? Lestrade handed it over, triumphant. I read as Holmes skimmed. Speak now, O Ash, and tell them plain whose red right hand shall rise again. It was convincing enough to raise the hair on one's neck. Holmes laid it beside the other scraps from Carrick's study. Lestrade continued. We believe Renner admired Dawn, fancied himself a successor. When Rowe began exposing the truth, Renner silenced him. Holmes's voice was quiet, so he forged Dawn's voice. Why? To finish the poem, Lestrade said, to make himself relevant. Holmes said nothing for a long moment, only studied the paper. Finally, he turned away. "Well," he said, "congratulations." Lestrade left visibly pleased with himself. But the door had barely shut before Holmes snatched up the supposed second page and held it against the light. "There," he muttered. "Ink inconsistency. The left margin's alignment is tighter than Rowe's usual hand. And this stanza, red right hand, Dawn's motif, not Rowe's, to overt. You believe Renner forged it? I believe Renner found part of the page and completed it to please someone, to protect someone. He may be guilty of deceit, even obstruction, but not murder." I frowned. "Then why pawn the cane?" Holmes's expression darkened. "Because he was instructed to, or frightened into it." We left at once, ignoring Lestrade's boasts echoing from Scotland Yard as we passed. At Renner's flat, we searched the back room, guided by Holmes's hunch. Under a loose floorboard, we found a second scrap of the poem, faded, torn, but unmistakably Rowe's hand. This one read, "In silence's grip, I etched the lie, not for him, but one nearby." Holmes's eyes lit with something close to fury. He knew. Rowe saw through the deception. This page was meant for someone close, not Dawn. Someone who feared exposure just as much. We returned to Carrick that afternoon. He opened the door, pale and drawn, as though anticipating our visit. "I know why you're here," he said. "Renner." Holmes said nothing, only watched him. Carrick led us in. He confessed to the theft, said he found Rowe's envelope on my desk. He never mentioned the second page. Holmes replied coldly, "Because the second page was never in the envelope. Rowe gave it to someone he trusted." Carrick sat slowly. "You think it was me? I think you want the world to believe it was Renner," Holmes said. "Because if Renner falls, the trail dies." Carrick was silent. Holmes stepped forward, voice tightening. "But I've read Rowe's letters. I've read your editorials. And I've read Marjorie's early essays in the Hollow Bell. One thread runs through all three. Felix Dawn was more than a poet to each of you. He was a cipher, a flame around which you all circled and which burned you, one by one." Carrick's voice cracked. "We were children. He was magnetic, dangerous. We followed him too far." Holmes didn't blink. "And now I have no contact. I swear it." "Then explain this." Holmes pulled from his coat pocket a telegram, sent from your house to a London printer nights ago. "Complete the second stanza. Make it bleed. Signed, M." Carrick went white. "Marjorie. We found her in the reading room of the British Library, calmly annotating a worn volume of Dawn's first collection. She looked up without surprise, as though she had long expected Holmes to appear at her shoulder. "Did he tell you?" she asked softly. Carrick, "No," Holmes said. "He suspected." I confirmed. She closed the book, tracing its edge with her fingers. "I couldn't let it be published. Not the truth, not what Felix wrote, not what Jonathan feared. You rewrote Rowe's last words," Holmes said. "You gave them to Renner to finish." "I didn't kill him," she said quickly. "I loved him, despite everything. But I knew what he'd hidden in that verse. If the world read it, it would destroy us all." "You feared exposure," Holmes said. that your part in Dawn's disappearance would come to light. I feared a war of words turned real. Dawn is still alive. He sent me a letter a month ago. I burned it. He said he was coming to write his final poem across London's streets. She reached into her bag and handed Holmes a folded page, a carbon copy of the telegram. Holmes opened it. At the bottom, in faint pencil, was a line in Dawn's unmistakable hand. The ink is ready. The final line falls at dusk. Holmes's jaw tightened. Then the poem, he whispered, is not finished, not yet. Holmes stood beneath the high arch of the reading room's window, the grey London light haloing his sharp figure, eyes fixed on the note in Dawn's hand. The final line falls at dusk. It was no metaphor. Dawn never wrote metaphor unless it had teeth. The clock read 20 minutes. Past 3. We had, at most, a few hours. I stepped toward Marjorie, whose pale knuckles clutched her satchel as if it contained the ghost of Dawn himself. When exactly did you receive this letter? 5 days ago, she whispered, but I didn't believe it at first. I thought it a cruel hoax until I saw Rose's second page vanish. And Renner, he panicked. I asked him to replicate the final stanza, to delay everything. I thought if we could fake closure, perhaps Dawn would stay buried. Holmes spoke without looking at her. Tell me about 1878. Marjorie flinched. You've read the Aldwych tragedy. I've read between the lines, Holmes said. The fire that destroyed the Upper Aldwych Theatre. 5 lives lost. The only survivor, a stagehand named Felix Dunn, later known to the world as Felix Dawn. She nodded. I was only a girl, but I remember the night. My father was the director. The play was meant to debut Dawn's first major piece. Something went wrong. Something terrible. The fire, I said. It wasn't an accident, was it? She looked away. It was a ritual, not in the arcane sense, but in the theatrical. Dawn believed in erasing his past, burning it down. He'd had a dispute with one of the lead actors, claimed he'd stolen a line, diluted his meaning. That night, something snapped. The entire third act was performed in pitch black, no stage lighting, and at the climax, a torch was dropped or thrown. The velvet curtains caught. I remember the screams. Holmes turned at last, and Carrick, he was Dawn's apprentice, loved him, worshipped him. He helped him escape the scene, invented the name, gave him his first real stage, the printed word. Holmes paced now, thoughts threading through the room. So the true Dawn died. In that fire, in a sense. But the myth lived, and Roe, years later, uncovered the bones beneath the myth. Marjorie nodded, and tried to bury them properly. But Dawn always promised his last poem would be written not in ink, but in action. We left immediately. Holmes took us back not to Baker Street, but to a records archive near Fleet Street, where he demanded access to trial transcripts, burial records, and editorials surrounding the Aldwych fire. The silence was thick with the scent of old paper, and secrets. It was there we found the missing thread. The coroner's report lists 5 dead. Holmes murmured, eyes scanning. 3 actors, a musician, and the costume master. But look here, body to damaged for identification. Presumed to be Felix Dunn based on witness placement. And yet Dunn lived, I said, meaning someone else was misidentified. Holmes nodded slowly, or sacrificed in his place. The name of the costume master, Elias Firth, caught his eye. Holmes pulled the burial record closed casket, funeral paid for in cash by an anonymous donor. Then he froze. Watson, Elias Firth was Marjorie's uncle. I blinked. That's impossible. She said her father ran the theatre. Her father did, but her uncle worked beneath the stage, quiet, unnoticed, until he disappeared. Marjorie was a child. How would she remember one man among many in the smoke? We returned to Carrick's townhouse with urgency pounding in our veins. This time, Holmes didn't knock. He entered like a storm. Carrick looked up from his desk, startled. "Where is he?" Holmes demanded. Carrick hesitated. "Who?" "Elias Firth." The color drained from Carrick's face. "He's dead." "No," Holmes said. "He became Felix Dawn, the true one, the man who survived the fire. While Dunn burned in his place, you helped him disappear. You wrote his legend, but someone always knew." Carrick trembled. "Roe." Holmes nodded. Roe uncovered the switch. That the dawn we worshipped was a construct born of fire and guilt. The poems, the threats, they weren't revivals. They were real, the original. Dawn Firth has returned, and he's angry. It was then that Carrick finally broke. He sent me a manuscript, not verse confession. He said I had 3 days to print it in full, or he'd release it another way. I thought if I allowed the police to arrest Renner, it would stall him. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You made the false case look whole. But the poem continues. Tonight, dusk." Carrick's voice fell to a whisper. "He's going to the old with ruins. What's left of them?" The 3 of us arrived just as the light began to fade, casting long shadows across the skeletal remains of the theatre. The old foundation lay bare, stones blackened with age and ash, vines crawling over broken walls. And there, in the center of the ruin, stood a man in a dark coat and red scarf, hair ghost white under the grey sky. Felix Dawn. He was older than legend suggested, gaunt but upright. His voice, when he spoke, was clear. I waited for someone to tell the truth. Instead, they built a myth. So tonight, I finished the verse myself. Holmes stepped forward. "You murdered Roe?" "I freed him," Dawn said. "He was already drowning in their lies. I gave him a final stanza worthy of his search." "You came back for vengeance," Holmes said. "But why now?" Dawn looked to the sky. "Because dusk comes for all men, eventually, especially those who hide behind poetry." And then he reached into his coat and held up not a weapon, but a manuscript. Holmes took it from his hand. A full confession. Every secret, every betrayal, every false line scrubbed clean. "I will not be caged," Dawn said, softly, "but I will be heard." He turned and walked toward the far wall of the ruin, where a crumbling archway framed the last of the light. For a moment, I thought he would vanish like a ghost, but when we followed, he was gone. Only his words remained, and the shadows he left behind. Holmes stood still for a moment at the crumbled archway, where Dawn had vanished, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the ruin. No sign of footsteps, no displaced stones. The man had disappeared as effortlessly as he had reappeared from the annals of the past. Yet Holmes did not seem frustrated. In fact, I noticed something close to satisfaction flash across his face. "He wanted us to see him," Holmes murmured. "That was not an escape, it was an audition." Back at Baker Street, the manuscript Dawn had left behind lay carefully opened on Holmes's desk. Every word, every line, meticulously penned. Not verse, but prose that read like scripture heavy. With emotion, burdened by time, Holmes read aloud, pacing. "He writes not of guilt, but of betrayal," Holmes said. Carrick, Marjorie, Renner each used Dawn's identity for their own ends. They shaped his voice until it served them. Even Rowe, in seeking truth, threatened the purity of Dawn's myth. I frowned. But why now? Why this elaborate return? Holmes tapped the margin of the manuscript. "This paragraph. Look here. I have one last performance to stage, and one final critic to address. That is not poetic flourish. That is tactical intention." He crossed to his violin case. But rather than opening it, he reached behind it for a slim fold of pages, of psychological profiles, theater reviews, and notes on voice modulation. Dawn has always seen the world as a stage. His crimes are not acts of vengeance, they're acts of theater, each meant to provoke a reaction, to draw out a truth. And yet he left, I said, just walked away. "Because his play isn't over," Holmes replied. "He's waiting for the audience to catch up." I watched Holmes with increasing unease as he returned to the manuscript and drew a large sheet of paper from the drawer. He began transcribing, selected phrases, cutting them apart, rearranging them, pulling certain stanzas from Dawn's earlier works and setting them beside the new material. It was not poetry anymore. It was a cipher. "What are you doing?" I asked. "I'm inviting the cast to show their hand." Holmes said, "If Dawn's writing is his weapon, then his verses are footprints." 2 days later, an anonymous broadside appeared pasted to the gate of the Royal Dramatic Society. It was signed FD, but Holmes had written every line. The poem was titled Echo in Ashes. Its final verse read, "I speak not to fire, nor to stone, but to the voice that mimics my own. Come then, playwright, with mask in hand, reveal the script, and where you stand." The bait had been set. Now we would watch who flinched. That afternoon, Holmes arranged a meeting with Marjorie at the British Museum, under the pretense of revealing new evidence to clear Renner's name. Carrick was summoned as well. Holmes instructed me to observe. Then discreetly, while he arrived 10 minutes late by design. The moment Carrick entered and spotted the broadside folded in Marjorie's hand, his posture stiffened. But it was her reaction that betrayed something deeper. Her fingers trembled. Her eyes flicked toward the museum entrance, toward me, toward a nearby curator who happened to glance too long in her direction. Holmes entered just as Carrick muttered, "He knows." Holmes offered no greeting. He simply said, "You both read it." Carrick gave a weak nod. Marjorie tried to steady her hands by clasping them behind her back. "It's not from him," she said too quickly. "It's a forgery." Meant to provoke. Exactly, Holmes said. And you were provoked. Dawn's dead, Marjorie. The man who vanished beneath the old Wiharch, he wasn't Dawn at all. The silence was electric. Marjorie's voice dropped to a whisper. You're bluffing. Holmes looked at Carrick. He died in the fire, didn't he? The real Dawn. The man who vanished, he was your invention. Your actor. Carrick stammered. He was real. He was Elias Firth, Holmes said. Or a man you hired to play him. A role. One written years ago, and now conveniently resurrected to cover a murder. Marjorie turned away, but Holmes continued. You staged his return just as carefully as he once staged his own death. You gave the public what it craved, a legend made flesh, and then used that illusion to eliminate Roe. Carrick shook his head. That's insane, is it? Holmes said. I planted that poem not for Dawn but for you, to test your reaction, to bait the actor back on stage. You flinched, both of you, because someone still alive knows the original Dawn's final play, knows the truth you've buried. And then Holmes did something entirely unexpected. He produced a small, ornate snuff box and placed it on the table. This belonged to Dawn, found in the old with ruin. His initials are scratched inside. Carrick leaned forward, lips parted slightly. Marjorie didn't move. Holmes said nothing more, just waited. Carrick reached for the box, and the moment his fingers brushed it, Holmes seized his wrist. Got you. What is this? The snuff box is a forgery, Holmes said coldly. A test. You reacted like a man who had held it before. You recognized it not from a photograph but from memory, which means you've seen the real one. And the only place that box could have been was with Dawn, the real one, the man you buried. Marjorie exhaled sharply, the strength leaving her legs as she sank into a nearby bench. Carrick's mask broke then. It wasn't supposed to go this far. It never does, Holmes said. The authorities took Carrick in that evening. He confessed under pressure Dawn had indeed died in the fire, but Carrick preserved the name and used it as a puppet, manipulating others. Renner, Marjorie. Roe 4 years. When Roe uncovered inconsistencies in the origin of the earliest verses, he became a threat. Carrick created the illusion of Dawn's return, hired a look-alike, and engineered Roe's death as part of a staged revival. The manuscript had been real but written by Carrick himself in Dawn's style. Holmes later admitted to me that he'd known from the start something felt theatrical about the crime. Only a playwright, he said, would kill with a pen and leave behind a stage. And yet, as the curtain drew on the case, Holmes couldn't help but reread Echo in Ashes again. One wonders, he said quietly, if the ghost of Dawn might yet take his bow. It was just past midnight when I returned to Baker Street, the street lamp outside casting a long shadow across the sitting-room window. I found Holmes seated in complete stillness, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, and his eyes fixed not on a document or object, but on the space where one should have been. The manuscript, he said without turning. Gone. I froze. Gone. You locked it in your desk. I did, he replied, and someone opened it without a key. I stepped forward and saw the drawer in question had been forced, not shattered. all broken crudely, but subtly pried open with precision. No other items were disturbed. Whoever did this had known exactly what they were looking for. Holmes finally rose, opening the drawer fully and pulling out the remnants of the velvet pouch. That had encased the manuscript. It had been sliced clean through, the cut so fine it was nearly invisible unless touched. "I checked it an hour ago," he murmured. "It was here." I looked to the window. Locked. So was the door. Someone with access. Holmes shook his head. No. Someone with skill and timing. They waited until Carrick's confession broke across the morning editions, when our focus turned to corroborating details, when we were distracted. But who? Carrick is in custody. Marjorie's under watch. Renner hasn't left his studio. Holmes turned to the fireplace. In the grate, faint traces of ash caught the breeze. Not from wood, from paper. He knelt, pulling a cold poker from the hearth and sifting through the residue. "Only the final 2 pages," he muttered. "The rest is missing. Why not burn it all?" "Because the rest is still useful," Holmes said. Someone needed to erase what Carrick added at the end his confession masked as poetry. He stood, brushing his coat sleeve clean. The fire tells us more than the thief intended. It was fast. They panicked. The paper curled and blackened, but some fragments survived. Holmes withdrew a scrap with tweezers and held it under the lamp. 2 words remained. Allstone Manor. It hit us simultaneously. The location where Dawn had allegedly composed his final verses. A derelict estate Carrick once claimed was haunted by genius, a place of myth until now. We arrived at dawn. The manor stood in ruinous silence atop a wooded hill, windows gaping, ivy choking its frame. Holmes moved quickly, ignoring the crumbling outer rooms and heading straight for the cellar beneath the east wing. "How did you?" "It's the only room with new locks on rusted doors," Holmes said. The padlock was old but functional, and Holmes opened it with a flick of his tools. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and dust, but in the corner, beneath the faded drape, sat a wooden trunk. Within lay the rest of the manuscript. "I expected ash," I breathed. Holmes flipped through the pages. "No, not ash. Forgery." He held up 2 identical copies of the final poem. One matches Carrick's handwriting, the other less certain. A mimic, yes, but coarser. "Someone rewrote the ending, yes," Holmes said darkly. "Someone who wanted the world to believe Dawn lived again, and someone else who wanted to erase Carrick from that illusion." He paused. "Watson, the stage is larger than we imagined. We are no longer chasing a single actor. We are caught in a company of liars, as if summoned by his words. A single gunshot rang out. We ducked instinctively, Holmes drawing his pistol from beneath his coat as we pressed back into the shadows of the cellar. But no second shot came. We crept back upstairs, through the overgrown corridor to the rear of the manor, where the shot had come from. In the clearing beyond the garden wall, we found the source, a man, collapsed, still breathing, but barely dotted. Was Elias Firth the actor Carrick had used to portray the reborn Dawn? Holmes crouched beside him, placing 2 fingers against his neck. "He's alive, shot in the shoulder, Firth's eyelids fluttered open. He saw Holmes and flinched. "Who did this?" Holmes asked. The man tried to speak, lips moving, but only a raspy breath emerged. Holmes pressed a cloth to the wound. "Was it Marjorie?" Firth shook his head. "Was it Renner?" Another headshake. "Then who?" The man raised his hand weakly and pointed not toward the house, but toward the wood behind it. Holmes turned. A narrow trail led into the trees. Recent footprints disturbed the mud dot the attacker had fled. "I need you to live," Holmes told Firth. "You're the last thread that connects illusion to reality." But Firth had passed out. We summoned a surgeon from the nearest village and had Firth taken under guard. By dusk, he was resting. Holmes returned to Baker Street alone and found chaos waiting. The police inspector who had overseen Carrick's arrest was there, face pale, holding a tattered envelope. "Carrick's dead," he said. "Poisoned." Holmes went still. "He was found this morning. No signs of forced entry. Only a folded page left on his bunk." Holmes took the envelope. Inside was a single line, handwritten in bold ink. "Curtin Core, old friend, the role is yours now." Beneath it, a signature .f.d. not Carrick. Not Firth, someone else. The original, or a new player in disguise? Holmes dropped into his armchair and stared at the letter as though it had fangs. "The game has shifted," he said. I didn't speak, because I saw it in his eyes. For the first time in this case, Sherlock Holmes wasn't certain who the playwright truly was. Rain lashed the cobblestones of Baker Street that night with the same fevered rhythm. Beating in my chest, Holmes had not spoken since the note was delivered. But I saw his silence was not that of retreat. It was the hum before the coil struck. He stood at the hearth, unmoving, his eyes locked on the fire, but his mind leagues beyond. "Watson," he said finally, voice low, "tell Lestrade to double the guard on Elias Firth, and send word to Renner and Marjorie. Tell them to remain where they are. You believe the killer will strike again?" "I believe," he said, "that they already have." He reached for his coat. I followed without asking. We were halfway down the stairs when a boy young, breathless, burst through the door. "Sir, Mr. Holmes, sir, you're needed right now, down by the embankment. What's happened? They found a body just now. Not a beggar, not a thief. They say he's dressed like a priest, but holding a painter's brush. Madness." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Renner?" The boy nodded. "Within 15 minutes we were on the banks of the Thames, fog curling like fingers through the gaslight. Renner's body lay on the slick cobbles, face frozen in a half-smile, half-grimace, eyes fixed on the water as if still seeing what had pulled him under. His hands were clean. To clean. No ink, no oil, and yet clutched in one was an artist's. Brush broken at the shaft. No sign of a struggle," murmured Lestrade, joining us. "But he was seen alive not 2 hours ago. Then someone wanted him quiet before he could speak." Holmes replied. He stooped, examining the coat pockets. From the inner lining he withdrew a folded slip of paper creases, fresh, ink barely, dry, dotted red. "He who paints the dead must lie still in turn FD." The letters danced before me. This villain taunts us. No, Watson, Holmes said, eyes gleaming. He challenges us. We returned to Baker Street, but we did not rest. Holmes spread the notes, the original poem, Carrick's letter, and now this cryptic verse across the table. His fingers hovered above them, as if expecting the words to rearrange themselves into a confession. Then he stopped. Look closely, Watson. The phrasing. Each note contains a specific rhythm. Dawn's poetic meter, but subtly warped. He flipped over Renner's note and jotted beside it. He who paints the dead must lie still in turn. That's iambic tetrameter, Holmes whispered. Almost perfect, but not quite. There's one syllable off in the second foot, intentional, as though the author mimics Dawn, but cannot fully become him. A flaw in the impersonation, a tell, Holmes said. One we've overlooked until now. He stood and paced. Carrick's death, Firth's attack, Renner's staged drowning. Each act is meant to silence, but not entirely. Each leaves a verse, a token, which means Marjorie is next. Yes, he said, and she must not fall into his trap. But even as he said it, the door below slammed open. Boots thundered on the stairs. Marjorie burst into the room, breathless, soaked from the rain. Holmes, he's taken her. Who? Holmes demanded. Florence, she gasped. My sister. She's gone. I found her flat ransacked. The door was locked from the inside, no sign of forced entry. And Florence vanished. Only this was left. She handed Holmes a small paper envelope. Inside was a single grey feather and a torn piece of a sonnet. No voice is sweeter than silence kept when truth and pain have not yet slept. Holmes closed his eyes. This isn't murder, he said. It's theatre. Marjorie was trembling. He wants me to come after her. Yes, Holmes replied. He wants an audience. Then I'll go. No, Holmes said firmly. You'll do nothing until I say. But she'll die. Holmes turned to her. Not if we understand the next act. He is building to something climactic. Florence is bait. You are the prize. Marjorie stared at him, eyes welling. Holmes began to pace again, muttering. He's escalating, risking more. Renner's death was too theatrical, there are witnesses. Carrick's murder, sloppy. He's becoming emotional, slipping. Then he's afraid or desperate, Holmes corrected. Which means we still have time. He stopped. Watson, get me the map of London's theatres, especially the ones recently closed. I did so, and within minutes Holmes was tracing lines with his finger. He has crafted every scene so far with a performer's precision. He needs a stage for the final act, somewhere hidden, forgotten, a place linked to Dawn. He jabbed a spot on the map. The Orion Theatre. It was a derelict music hall, shuttered for 5 years after a fire. Dawn had performed there once, years ago, in his only public reading before he vanished. That's where he'll take her, Holmes said. He's not just reliving Dawn's work. He's trying to finish it. We left within minutes. Marjorie between us, pale and silent. The Orion loomed ahead like a rotting cathedral. Holmes broke the chain on the side entrance and led us inside. The air stank of damp velvet and ash. The stage was still intact bare, but lit from above by a single flickering gas lamp. In the center sat Florence, bound, eyes wide, and standing behind her, half hidden in the wings, was a figure cloaked in black. He stepped forward, not Carrick, not Firth, not Dawn, but someone new. "I'm glad you came," the man said softly. "All of you." He stepped into the light, and Marjorie gasped. "Julian," her voice was brittle. "My brother is dead." "He was," the man replied. "But so was Dawn until I gave him a voice again." Holmes's hand slowly moved inside his coat. Julian laughed. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, ever the realist. You saw it all, didn't you? But never quite saw me." "I saw a puppeteer," Holmes said evenly. "One who grew tired of pulling strings and longed to take the stage himself." Julian's eyes glimmered. "I was always in the wings, ghostwriting, scripting until Carrick stole it. My voice, my words. He tried to expose you. He tried to claim me." Julian stepped forward. "But this is my finale now. My death, my resurrection. And you," he looked at Marjorie, "you're the only critic whose opinion ever mattered." Holmes drew his pistol. "Step away from her." But Julian only smiled. "No, you don't end the play before the curtain falls." And he pulled the rope beside him. Above, something groaned, and then a crash of movement. From the rafters, a second body fell, hanging, Carrick. Holmes fired. The rope snapped. Julian turned to run, but Marjorie had already crossed the distance. She grabbed him by the collar, and together they fell. Across the stage, crashing into the scenery. By the time Lestrade arrived, the curtain had quite literally fallen, and Holmes, breath shallow, blood on his cuff from where Julian had slashed at him in the scuffle, stood over the broken stage and muttered, "The play is nearly over." But his eyes said otherwise, because one page still hadn't been turned. The damp boards of the Orion Theatre creaked beneath Holmes's pacing footsteps as Lestrade and his men swept the hall. Julian Dornor, whatever piece of him still clung to that name, had been taken, half-conscious, muttering stanzas like prayers. Florence, shaken but unharmed, sat with Marjorie near the orchestra pit, both wrapped in wool blankets brought in haste. I approached Holmes, who stood motionless near the curtain ropes. The pistol in his hand hung loose now, forgotten. "You're troubled," I said. "I'm unsatisfied," he replied, his voice a notch above a whisper. "This should be resolution. Watson, we've unmasked the villain. The bodies are accounted for. And yet," I waited. He quoted the poem again. Holmes murmured as Carrick fell. "And in the final act, the dead shall rise." It is from Dawn's first collection, except that poem never saw publication. Only 3 people read it in manuscript: Carrick, Julian, and... He turned slowly. Marjorie. She looked up, startled. "Yes, he showed me once, long ago, when he was young, before Florence took ill. He trusted me." "Why?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He knelt instead beside the dropped notes Julian had been carrying, pages torn, scribbled, some soaked with blood. His eyes scanned each line as if decrypting code. "There's something wrong here," he muttered. "This entire case, it's Too recursive. Everything loops back to the same symbols: feathers, silence, performance, death. He flipped a page, but no mention of fire. Fire? I asked. Renner's studio burned last year. The Orion Theatre suffered a fire before. It closed, and yet Dawn's poetry never once references fire as a motif. That's unnatural. Marjorie stood now, crossing the boards toward him. What does that mean? Holmes turned a page, then another. Then he froze. Watson, he said sharply, do you remember the poem Carrick showed me the night he died? The line about echoes dancing behind closed lips. Yes, I nodded. It was part of his warning, wasn't it? It wasn't in Dawn's original manuscripts, Holmes said slowly, and yet Julian claimed to be quoting it directly. But here, he held up a blood-stained page from Julian's notes. This same line is here, in Julian's handwriting, yet the style doesn't match his other verses. I stared. So you're saying? I'm saying someone else was writing for Julian. Florence's voice rang from behind us, soft, weak. He never wrote, not after 1897. He dictated everything. Holmes turned sharply. He told me he had tremors in his hand. Said it was from the opium. He could no longer hold a pen for long. Then who transcribed his poems? Florence looked down. I don't know. But Marjorie had gone pale. She stepped back. No, she said. It wasn't me. No one said it was. Holmes said gently. I only typed what he spoke. She insisted, trembling now. I was helping him. He said he needed order, clarity, structure. Holmes stepped toward her, slowly. You structured the lines. She swallowed. He rambled. Always. The stanzas made no sense. I just broke them into lines, shaped them, so you edited them, only for clarity. And the metaphors? Holmes asked softly. The themes, silence, masks, hidden depths. The theatre. That wasn't Julian, was it? Marjorie said nothing. Holmes nodded slowly. You tried to save him when he came to you. Broken by Carrick's betrayal, strung out and incoherent, you did what any sister might. You tried to give him a voice again, a clear one. I didn't. No, he'd kill. You gave him the script, Holmes said. He simply acted. Marjorie trembled, eyes wide. Florence reached for her hand. But Holmes turned away and gestured to me. Come, Watson. Outside, the night had grown quiet. The rain now a soft mist clinging to gaslight halos. Holmes walked without speaking for some distance until the glowing windows of a bakery bled warmth into the gloom. The pattern is literary, he said suddenly. It always was, a mimicry not only of style, but of structure. Julian didn't just kill Carrick, he was performing a tragedy in 5 acts. Each victim was a symbol. Renner the painter, blinded by beauty. Carrick the betrayer, cast from grace. Firth the coward, who fled the flame. Florence the innocent, bound to silence. And Marjorie, the author. We stood there for a long while. And now? I asked. Holmes exhaled. We let Lestrade finish his paperwork. Julian will hang. The world will know him as the madman, who thought himself a poet. And Marjorie, he looked away. She'll carry the weight, he said quietly. And perhaps that is punishment enough. A carriage passed slowly in the mist, hooves muffled on the wet stones. Holmes turned back toward Baker Street, his coat clinging to him like a shadow. I followed, silent. The night behind us, the mystery before us always unfolding, always in verse. Holmes stood at the mantel in Baker Street, untouched cup of tea, cooling beside him, the weight of Marjorie's silence still thick in the air. The case, in the eyes of the police and the press, had found its resolution. Julian Dorn, mad poet, disgraced artist of verse and violence, was now held in Newgate under heavy guard. Yet Holmes had not rested. I had watched him spend 2 nights, walking circles in our sitting room, muttering fragments of poetry under his breath, piecing together the shadows left unspoken. I was about to speak when he suddenly said, "Do you recall what Julian whispered as they took him away? Not the verse, but what came after." I nodded. She knew. She made me say it. I only gave the final line. Holmes tapped a finger once against the hearth. It wasn't metaphor. Not this time. He meant it literally. "You're thinking of Marjorie again?" "No," Holmes said. I wasn't till the final report arrived from Florence's doctor. "You didn't read it." I asked that it be sent directly to me. He reached for the envelope on the table and drew out the pages. "It concerns Florence's vocal condition. Not congenital, not neurological, not psychosomatic. She was poisoned." I straightened. "Arsenic. In doses too small to kill at first. Over time, it paralyzed the vocal cords. Untraceable in small quantities after months of accumulation. Someone was silencing her deliberately. But why? That is what troubled me," Holmes replied. "She had no fortune, no social influence, no knowledge of criminal dealings. She posed no threat." He pulled a second file from the pile. "But her father, Rupert Leving, did." I blinked, dredging the name from memory. An industrialist. Died bankrupt. Scandalous fall from grace. But that was years ago. Not long enough, Holmes said. Leving's firm went under after a series of poor investments. But the books never added up. Florence, as it turns out, had taken possession of a set of journals he left behind. Financial records, private correspondences, nothing criminal on their own. But they hinted at something more. Holmes moved to the bureau, opening a small drawer. Inside was the notebook Florence had slipped into his hand the night Julian was taken away. She gave me this just before she collapsed. I hadn't time to read it until now. I scanned the page he offered. Handwritten, erratic, but legible. My sister kept him alive. I read aloud, fed him the words he couldn't find. But not for love, not anymore. She needed the legacy. She needed to finish the cycle. Holmes nodded. That's the word she repeats. Cycle. It was. Never about revenge for Julian. Not only. It was about completing something. He stepped back and sat in his chair, folding his long fingers. "You see, Watson, the motive wasn't just grief or vengeance, it was creation. Marjorie wasn't helping Julian recover his voice. She was building her own." "You mean?" "She was the true author behind his final works. Florence's silence protected her for years. Carrick's betrayal gave her the perfect narrative, Julian as the tragic victim. Reborn in poetic fury. But when Florence found the journals and began reading aloud before the poisoning took her voice, she discovered the truth, that their father hadn't been ruined by poor investments, but by someone quietly draining his capital. Marjorie, I said, she needed money for her studies abroad. She falsified documents, sold securities in secret, and buried the trail in Leving's name. Florence's silence was never a result of illness, it was manufactured, just as Julian's poetry was. I felt a slow chill creep in. She poisoned Florence to protect herself. Holmes nodded, and when Julian returned, shattered, she seized the opportunity. Florence, trapped in muteness, could no longer protest. Marjorie nurtured Julian's madness, directed it, honed it until he became the weapon that would eliminate anyone who had ever threatened their family's name. Carrick, Renner, Firth, each one served to complete the tragic arc of a life rewritten. But then why attack Florence in the theater? Because Florence had begun to write again, even without speech. She had been compiling her memories, her truths. Julian found her notes and turned to Marjorie for guidance. She panicked. Dawn's last act wasn't just one of madness, it was carefully staged, and not by him. Holmes leaned forward, eyes gleaming. The poem Julian recited wasn't his final one. It was hers. She wrote it, whispering it in his ear, and timed the final act to coincide with Florence's death. That would have silenced everything, the truth, the guilt, and the origin of her masterpiece. I swallowed hard. She used him, utterly, Holmes said. And now he sits in a cell, believing himself the author of his own destruction. What will you do? Holmes stood. Call on Lestrade. Have Marjorie brought in again. We have a new document, Florence's notebook, and I believe a handwriting comparison. We'll seal what reason already concludes. And if she denies it, she won't, Holmes said. She's too proud. She's written her perfect tragedy. She'll want someone to recognize the true author. As he reached for his coat, I asked, and Julian? Holmes paused at the door. In some ways, he said quietly, he was always the victim. But that is the tragedy of puppets, Watson. They bleed just the same. The grey rain fell in hushed rhythm outside Scotland Yard as Holmes and I entered through the rear, avoiding the press that had begun to swarm the front entrance ever since. Julian Dorn's incarceration had made headlines. Lestrade, summoned at Holmes's urgent request, met us in his office, his usually impatient face now taut with apprehension. She's here, he said quietly, arrived as instructed, seemed unnervingly calm, if I'm honest. She would be, Holmes replied. She believes she has authored an ending no one can rewrite. Lestrade handed over the slim file Florence had left behind. Holmes opened it carefully, drawing out to pages, one penned in Marjorie's known hand, the other in the script of the final poem Julian had delivered the night Florence nearly died. I've had your experts look over these, Lestrade said. Their verdict is unanimous, same author, same hand, down to the idiosyncratic loops on her G's and the sharp flicks on her T's. Thank you, Inspector. Now let's see if the author of tragedy can withstand her own denouement. The interrogation room was cool, sterile, and quiet. Marjorie Leving sat alone, hands folded neatly on the table, eyes lifted as we entered not in fear, but in cool anticipation. She wore a charcoal dress, hair pulled back, her bearing severe and composed. For a moment, there was no sound but the quiet tapping of Holmes's cane against the tile. "Miss Leving," Holmes began, setting the file on the table and drawing out the 2 pages, laying them side by side. "You may recognize your own handwriting." Her gaze flicked down, unreadable. "What is this?" "The poem spoken by Julian Dorn in the Queen's Hall Theatre. And this," he tapped the second, "your lecture notes on Byron, submitted to your university last year. I fail to see the relevance. Then allow me to assist." The former was allegedly authored by Mr. Dorn, but a court-appointed analyst has determined the handwriting belongs to you. She lifted her chin slightly. "That proves nothing. Julian often dictated to me. It's true he did, but Florence's notebook tells a different story." Holmes opened the small book, careful not to let her reach it, and began reading. She made him believe the words were his, spoke softly, repeating until he heard them in his own voice. Marjorie blinked once. "That proves nothing." "No." Holmes's tone sharpened just a shade. "Then consider this. Florence's sudden muteness, once thought to be psychological, was caused by arsenic administered slowly over months. Arsenic found, incidentally, in the ink of a particular fountain pen you gifted her 2 years ago. The pen was tested. The trace remained. Marjorie didn't speak. Her fingers tightened, then loosened. You silenced her because she knew. She knew what you had done to your father. She found the records, the falsified transactions. She knew. His disgrace wasn't due to poor fortune, but theft. Your theft. She was my sister," Marjorie whispered. "She was your conscience," Holmes corrected. "And Julian. He was your instrument. A man driven mad by betrayal, searching for truth in verse truth you constructed for him, one line at a time." "Stop," she said, more sharply now. But Holmes did not stop. He leaned forward, gaze unrelenting. "You wrote every poem, Marjorie. You tailored his madness into a performance, turning tragedy into theatre. And when Florence tried to speak when she began to write, you used Julian to silence her once and for all. But she gave me this." He held up Florence's notebook. "You didn't expect her to pass it on. You didn't expect her to survive. But she did. And now your verse has turned against you." Marjorie rose suddenly, her chair screeching back. "You have no proof. You think handwriting and conjecture will convict me." Julian confessed. "You were there." He admitted everything. He recited the poem you wrote for him. That was his confession. He said I made him say it. He was raving. That's not admissible. But the pen is, the journals are, the poem in your hand is, and Julian, he's no longer protecting you. That struck home. Her breath caught, and her composure faltered. "I spoke to him yesterday," Holmes continued. "I told him the truth, that Florence lived, that you had manipulated him, that the words he believed were his salvation were, in fact, your control." He wept. "Miss Leving, not for his crimes, but for your betrayal." Marjorie stood frozen. Holmes stepped forward, voice now iron beneath its velvet. "I have built the case, Miss Leving, you can either help write the final stanza or be buried beneath it." The silence in the room stretched taut, until at last she laughed a hollow, fractured sound. "I gave him beauty," she said bitterly. "He was just a shell, a howling animal in a man's skin. I gave him purpose, meaning. That's more than anyone else ever did. And you took lives to do it," Holmes said quietly. "You turned grief into theatre, and used madness as a pen." Marjorie looked at him then, something defiant and broken warring behind her eyes. But she said nothing more. Lestrade entered with 2 constables, nodding ones. Marjorie's hands were taken gently but firmly, and she walked without resistance. Though her eyes never left Holmes's, when the door closed behind her, Holmes sighed, returning to the file as if it were merely a document awaiting review. "She will not fight the charges," he said. "Her vanity won't allow her to deny authorship." "And Julian?" I asked. "He will live, Watson. Scarred, yes, but perhaps, with time, he will write his own truth." He picked up the notebook and read a final line, Florence's words. She sewed her verses into silence, believing no one would ever hear them scream. Then he closed the book, and the rain outside began to ease. Holmes stood in silence at the window of Baker Street as the morning sun pierced the gloom that had long hung over the case. The arrest of Marjorie Leving had stunned the public, and in literary circles her name had already begun its descent from acclaim into infamy. Florence, slowly recovering, had been moved to a private nursing home in Hampstead under a false name, protected from press and poetry alike. As for Julian Dorn, he had returned to silence, though no longer madness. Holmes believed he had begun writing again, but not in verse. Not yet. I glanced at the paper Holmes had discarded beside his untouched breakfast. An editorial titled "The Puppeteer Poetess: The Madness Behind Genius." It painted the affair in broad strokes, dramatizing Marjorie's confession and deifying Holmes's deduction. But there was something in his stillness that unsettled me. "You're not satisfied," I said finally. He turned slightly, the shadow of a frown flickering at the corners of his eyes. "I am not." But she confessed. The handwriting, the pen, Florence's notebook, it was all conclusive. Indeed, which is precisely what troubles me. I blinked. "You mean to say it was too conclusive? She confessed far too easily, Watson." There was no denial, no attempt to mislead or discredit, not even a demand for legal counsel. It was as if she had been waiting for someone to catch her. Pride, perhaps? Holmes shook his head. "No, not pride. Permission." Before I could ask what he meant, Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door, hesitant. "Mr. Holmes, a man's come to see you, refuses to give a name, says it's about the Dawn case. Send him in." Holmes said immediately. The man who entered was slim and severe, wearing a grey wool coat that had not seen wear in years. His face was pale, with a deep scar running from his cheekbone to the base of his jaw. But it was his eyes that captured Holmes's full attention, cold, exacting, and entirely void of uncertainty. He placed a sealed envelope on the table and stepped back. "This," he said softly, "is not something I could leave to coincidence. I needed to see you read it. Holmes picked up the envelope, slit it open, and unfolded a single typed sheet. I watched as his brow furrowed and his eyes narrowed to slits. "Watson," he said flatly, "do you recall Julian's friend, the one he credited as his first listener? A private patron from his early days, always unnamed." I nodded slowly. Yes, the mysterious benefactor he spoke of in those early interviews before Marjorie ever came into his life. Holmes held out the letter without a word. I took it and read. "Dear Mr. Holmes, if you're reading this, then Marjorie has fallen on the sword as I expected. She was always devoted, but she did not mastermind the verse. I did. She refined. She adapted. But the seed of every poem, every line that bent Julian to my will was mine. Florence was always going to die, but not out of jealousy, out of necessity. The truth is, Julian was always too close to seeing me clearly. Marjorie provided the fog. You have pulled it back, but the stage remains mine. Do not come looking. By the time you read this, I will no longer exist. Yours in rhythm and shadow." P.S. Holmes's voice was a razor as he finished aloud. P.S. the poet's shadow, an identity assumed and discarded over the years, credited with a handful of obscure, brilliant works, always anonymous, always disappearing before the trail could grow warm. "But this letter could be a hoax," I said. Holmes shook his head. "No, this explains what Marjorie never could. The precision of the psychological manipulation, the layering of narrative. Even Julian, in his madness, could feel the difference between her voice and the voice that had truly shaped his soul. This P.S. was the architect. Marjorie was his instrument. And now he's vanished." Holmes moved swiftly, collecting the envelope and placing it inside a metal tin. "We'll test the paper, ink, and type. And more than that, I will find every published work attributed to P.S. over the last 10 years. Somewhere in that body of work, he will have left a flaw. Even the greatest liar can't resist a signature." As we prepared to leave for the British Library, a small parcel arrived, no sender, no markings. Just our address and Holmes's name written in a curling, theatrical script. Inside was a single item, a thin book of poetry, whispers in a paper skin, published under the name Julian Dorn. But inside, a dedication inked in red to the true conductor. "You heard the symphony when I was still deaf." Holmes stared at the words, then said without looking up, "We've closed a chapter, Watson. But the story continues, and outside, the streets of London turned their pages slowly, as if aware the final verse had yet to be written." Holmes had always moved with a particular kind of precision. But as we left the library that evening, having combed through hours of obscure journals and marginal poetry volumes, there was an uncommon tension to his gait. The name P.S. had appeared 4 times in a span of 7 years, never in major publications, always tucked inside niche literary reviews. Each poem bearing the fingerprints Holmes sought, linguistic structures bent like cages, metaphors that implied orchestration, not emotion. We returned to Baker Street just past sunset, our arms heavy with books and notations. Holmes cast them across the table and began to pin a sheet of paper to the wall above the fireplace. A timeline carefully built, the earliest known P.S. poem, dated precisely 1 month before Julian's first volume debuted. Another appeared 3 years later, shortly after Julian's brief retreat from publishing, then to more, one before. The Tragedy in Bath, and the final a chilling echo mere weeks before Florence's staged suicide. They were never poems, Holmes murmured. They were instructions. To Marjorie, to whoever was listening. Marjorie was just the most loyal. But why go to such lengths? Why hide behind a mask? Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward the parcel that had come the day before the book bearing Julian's name. The red dedication etched like blood, because he never wanted the fame, only the control. Anonymity was his camouflage and his dominion. To be known would be to surrender power. A knock broke the silence. Inspector Lestrade entered, coat damp from the drizzle outside, his face marked by irritation. "We've got something," he announced, glancing at Holmes. "Might be nothing, might be exactly what you're looking for." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "A body, male, early 40s, found by the river near Wapping, hands burned beyond prints. No ID. But in his coat pocket was this." He held up a water-damaged, charred fragment of paper. Holmes took it delicately across the stained parchment. Only 2 letters remained visible, just barely. P.S. Holmes. "Set it down." "Suicide?" I asked. Lestrade shrugged. "Could have been. Or someone tying off loose ends. No witnesses. But if that's your shadow poet, then I'd say the case is closed." Holmes didn't respond. He stood there, fingers steepled, eyes tracing patterns none of us could see. Later that night, after Lestrade had gone and London had sunk into its fog, Holmes explained. "The man in the coat, yes. Likely P.S., but whether he took his life or had it taken from him, we may never know. What matters is that he knew the net was tightening. The letter he left, the book he sent, they were not taunts, Watson, they were farewells. You believe he ended it himself? I believe he preferred that over being unmasked. Death was his final mask." He turned then to the sheet pinned above the fireplace. He added one final line, Wapping, dead or disappeared, then drew a single line through it. "But what if that wasn't him?" I said slowly. "What if he's still watching?" Holmes gave a rare, weary smile. "Then he's already lost, Watson." Because he blinked, he broke cover. No matter how carefully you orchestrate a performance, the moment you step onto the stage, you become part of the play. In the following days, the papers ran with headlines about the riddle of the river body. Speculation abounded. Julian Dorn issued a statement condemning those who had toyed with his art and sanity. Marjorie Leving was committed to Broadmoor, unfit for trial. Florence, recovering, still asked never to be contacted again. The case, for the public, was finished, but Holmes's wall remained. A week later, I found him adding something new beneath the timeline. A single sentence in his meticulous script. Justice was not found in a courtroom. It was wrestled from the shadows. Then, in softer pencil, and perhaps only half one, I looked at him. So he escaped. Holmes stared at the fire. No, but so did the truth. And with that, he turned, coat in hand. I believe we've earned an evening without ghosts, Watson, shall we? And as we stepped into the night, I couldn't help but feel that justice-like poetry often lived not in absolutes, but in the quiet spaces between. The fog drifted low over Baker Street as I watched Holmes pace, a fresh cup of tea untouched. By the hearth, though the case had closed officially, irreversibly he remained unsettled. It was not in his nature to rest easily, especially not with a body burned beyond recognition and a motive that had twisted itself into philosophical abstraction. I must admit, Holmes, I said at last, I thought this one had brought you some measure of finality. He turned sharply, eyes clouded with thought. Finality, Watson, is a matter for gravestones. We've merely left the stage while the house lights remain dim. Meaning, he crossed to his desk and picked up the last volume of Julian Dorn's collected works, the one postmarked anonymously and containing the now infamous dedication. He flipped to the back, past the glossy notes, and extracted a slip of paper I hadn't noticed before. It was so finely pressed against the inside of the cover that it could have gone untouched. Indefinitely, he handed it to me. It was a clipping, just a torn scrap from a foreign newspaper, French, judging by the print. I squinted to make sense of the headline. La mort du faussaire, un écrivain fantôme retrouve à Marseille. A ghostwriter found dead in Marseille. Holmes spoke low. The article dates back 6 months before Florence's overdose. The man was an anonymous contributor to several high society memoirs, some of which bore suspicious similarities to Julian's prose. I frowned. You believe P.S. wasn't working alone? I believe someone was curating talent. Ghostwriters, voices for hire, feeding them lines, images, tone, then discarding them once their utility waned. He leaned in. What if the poems weren't instructions, but recruitment ads, bait for those desperate to be read? Noticed even at the cost of their identity. I felt a cold ripple settle in my chest, and the man in Wapping, a decoy, perhaps a defector, or a scapegoat to preserve the true architect's anonymity. But you said the shadow had blinked, that the power was lost. His gaze darkened. I said he blinked, Watson, not that he vanished. Just then, the doorbell rang. Holmes stood unmoving while I opened the door. A small envelope lay alone on the front mat. No messenger, no footsteps down the stairs. I picked it up. Plain cream. Paper, sealed with wax. No emblem. Holmes took it from me and sliced it open with a scalpel-thin blade. Inside was a single strip of parchment, identical in style to the one found on the river corpse. The same strange parchment, the same red ink, to words only, not yet. We stared at it in silence. After a while, Holmes tucked it into the file marked Dawn and closed the drawer. Not locked, just closed. It appears, he said with an odd tightness in his voice, our audience remains. The weeks passed uneventfully on the surface. Lestrade moved on. Florence resumed her reclusive life abroad. The public's appetite for the case had dulled. But Holmes began collecting again. Not aggressively, but like a man gathering twigs for a fire he expected to light soon. unusual submissions to fringe poetry contests, pseudonymous editorials in forgotten zines, anonymous donations to small literary presses, all from the same offshore account. I asked him once, softly, what if he never returns? Holmes didn't look up from his cutting board. He will, because those who orchestrate from the dark rarely enjoy silence. The craving to be seen it always returns. And then, after a pause, he added, besides, he opened the drawer again. He already said so. The parchment still lay inside. Not yet, I nodded slowly. The game, it seemed, had simply paused. Holmes reached for his violin that evening, letting it wail long into the night, not in triumph, not in mourning, but in patience. For beneath every solved mystery lies the echo of a deeper one, and Holmes, as always, was listening.